Hello, everyone. It looks like folks are starting to trickle in. This is Sarah DeSilvi. It is the October 15th public work group meeting for the Gravity Project. There usually are a fair number of announcements ahead of time, so I'm going to start even as we let folks trickle in over the course of time. You can see here the topic of the day is multi-domain concept review, because as it stands now, as many of you who have come in the past can attest to, there's no longer one or even two domains at a time as we try to wrap around our screening and diagnosis work in order to make that application to ICD-10-CM. So next slide, please. So thank you in general, everyone. So due to the large number of attendees, we always mute everyone upon entry. We ask that everyone remain muted to avoid any background noise. We do record every one of our calls, and the recording is available on the Confluence after the call. We do try to very carefully work the chat to make sure that we are including everyone's voices as we discuss different topics. Please try to send the chat to everybody, and I will do my best to make sure that those thoughts are integrated as we march along. Next slide, please. This is just our standard antitrust practices slide. Next slide. We invite everybody to officially join the project. The link here is for the Join the Gravity Project link on the Confluence. If you want to check if you're already signed up or if others from your organizations have signed up, you can review existing membership at this other link. And then in general, the Confluence is an amazing resource for all kinds of information. Our project manager, Carrie, is helping us try to organize it better to make it a better user interface. But you can find information on past and current domains, announcements, and other updates, and information about how to vote, all on the Confluence for your use. Next slide, please. Just a nod to all of our project founders, grants, and in-kind supports. Next slide, please. If anyone would like to assist with funding for 2020 or 2021 operations, you can always follow the link there or send an email to the Gravity Project at emiadvisors.net. Next slide, please. Just want to mention, you all have heard this on our past calls, that the ONC has announced that United States core data for interoperability is open for submissions through October 23rd. This has been extended from October 9th. We are making a formal submission of our collective work. We've drafted a letter on behalf of the Gravity Project to include with the document.
Important to you, or if you have a different perspective, we'd like to incorporate that as well too.
Please mute, if you can please mute your phone just for the while we're on the call, just so we don't get feedback, that'd be great. Members of the Gravity community are invited and continue to join the letter. You can review the letter as it stands right on this link that you can find on the Confluence. We've been working really hard on that, and we're looking forward to getting it to the ONC for their review. Next slide, please. We do want to make a formal announcement that the official HL7 public meetings are scheduled on Wednesdays from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can see the full HL7 meeting calendar at this link. We do invite all of our community members who are interested in assisting with that technical build to join those meetings.
Sarah, can I just add here, this is Evelyn from HL7, since Bob's not on. Just a reminder, if we go back to the previous slide, we will not, through our Gravity listserv, be sending out calendar invites for the HL7 calls. Because these are scheduled under the HL7 patient care work group. calendar. So that's why we have the link here. You can manually go to this link and then just add it yourself to your calendar. And these are weekly. So unlike our public calls that are bi-weekly, the Fire IG calls are weekly, and all minutes are posted. So we do, because we have a smaller group of participants, we track minutes and attendance. So we do invite you, if you're interested in following the Fire IG bill, please join us on Wednesdays. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. This is just a reminder, again, about a grant opportunity that we discuss regularly. So the Administration for Community Living Challenge Grant is now accepting applications. There was just a webinar on this today that some of you might have attended. Registration is due December 14th. There have been some updates to the specifications for the grant. So if you saw the past version and you want to check in and see what's up to date, you can go to follow the link, and there's some new specifications. Evelyn, do you want to add anything else to that as well?
Yes. So previously the grant encouraged the adoption of gravity identified standards and referral as the technical approach. And now they have added the standards that are used for open referral. So our TAC member, as well as very active member of the Gravity Project, Greg Bloom, presented today and talked about how the project open referral can support the coordination work of this grant. So yes, so exciting. So please just note again that the goal of this is to have submissions due by December 14th. Awards are in early January, with the intent to start pilots in the spring, summer of next year, very much aligned with our Gravity Fire Implementation Guide publication that is scheduled for next year as well, and our reference implementation. So they're all tied. So thank you, Sarah.
It's our ecosystem of work, which is fairly connected. Yeah, thank you so much, Evelyn. So this is our agenda for the day. Briefly going to touch upon the new Gravity roadmap and upcoming domains, breezing through. I'm going to go through a couple slides on project schedule and terminology. We have an update to our voting process. We're continual ongoing learners, and so we have an update on how we're going to be voting that we'll discuss. We're then going to be talking about inadequate housing, transportation, financial strain, and then go through community homework and next steps. I have to get off the call a little early in order to go to a conference where I have to present before the top of the hour. So Evelyn or Carrie may help close out the conversation today. Next slide, please. So this is the roadmap, as you all have seen. This should not be new at this time. You can see that we're working through inadequate housing and transportation and financial strain, and heading into demographics in the upcoming meetings. And then even though these are truncated bars, because of the focus of our work on screening questions and answers and diagnoses, some of these bars of work may extend beyond the time you see here in order to continue to cover goals and interventions as we go forward with our labor. So even though these bars, I want to repeat, even though some of these bars are stopping, for instance, transportation at the end of December, work on goals and interventions for those domains may continue into 2021. At the bottom, you can see the technical build aiming for that IG ballot in the beginning of 2021. Next slide, please. Again, so this is just a way to envision what we're trying to aim for with our December 4th ICD-10 submission. For those of you who've been on past calls, you can remember that as in our past approach, it was going domain by domain, deep across all screening questions and answers, diagnoses, goals, and interventions. We still are going to maintain that work, making sure we have robust data sets to represent the labor of addressing each social risk. But in order to make that December 4th ICD-10 submission, we are focusing on screening and diagnoses for everything in the box on the left. for December 4th. And then looking forward into new domains in 2021 and completing goals and interventions work. Next slide, please. Again, this is just domains that we've discussed in our work that are defined but needed to be added to the timeline. In our EC call the other day, we were asked to clarify that part of the infrastructure term are concepts of digital inequity. We still, and concepts of communication equity, specifically digital inequity being important as we consider barriers to care with telehealth dependence within the pandemic. Next slide, please. So this is our calendar as it stands. Some of the concepts on here are fairly new. As you can see, we are changing our voting process. We'll go forward and to discuss that as we go forward in the next slides. But right now, we're in the middle of end-to-end review for inadequate housing, continuing our work for transportation, concepts review and submission, and kicking off financial strain. You can see your homework is to review and submit comments on the adequate housing master list. That's extremely important this time, and you'll find out why coming up. And then submitting concepts for transportation and financial strain. And then next meeting, we are having an in-person consensus vote, and I will talk about that very shortly, regarding all of the housing work, trying to close out those housing data sets so we can work toward build. And we'll also discuss transportation insecurity and financial strain, and introduce specific diagnostic language for education, veteran status, and employment. And then heading on November 12th to another diagnoses consensus vote, again, remembering that we're aiming for that December 4th ICD-10 submission. So, and then afterwards, not on this slide in the calendar, we'll again be looping back to discuss the interventions and goals work of the domains that are just being, we'll continue that work after we get the ICD-10 submission in. So I hope it's clear that number one, we're going to be focusing on a new voting methodology, and number two, that we really are just trying to hone in on diagnoses needs in order to make that December 4th submission, and more information about that will come in our future slides. Next slide, please. This is just the overview of the two areas of current gravity work: the terminology build, which is the side of the initiative. Ooh.
Or more postcard scans.
Oh, if you are not muted, can you currently mute your phone just so there's not feedback? That'd be appreciated. Thank you. So there's the terminology work that I lead, and then the technical work, which is led by my colleague, Bob Dieterle. Next slide, please.
Sarah?
Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
Regarding the submission to ICD-10,
Yeah.
is this scheduled for a cycle of submissions to ICD-10, or will this be a unique event for them and they consider it and then we see what happens?
That is the universal application deadline for all submissions to be heard at the March 2021 Coordination and Maintenance Committee meeting.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Lucy. This is again the graphic we are developing to try to represent the different phases of work we are in as we focus on our different domains. You can see we start with planning, then we collectively identify concepts, we collectively review them, we vote on them, we build, and then we test, evaluate, and it all feeds back, and it's an iterative process. Next slide, please. Any questions so far on anything we've covered so far? Okay, carrying on. Okay, new voting process. Next slide. As many of you can attest, we've been sending out lots of reminder emails to try and get the quorum we need to determine consensus on our data sets. And we are proposing a new mode of voting that leverages the engagement of those who are on the call and hopefully incentivizes participation in the call by holding a live vote, which is akin to the process we hold in every other one of our subcommittees. So our current process depends on asynchronous voting by submitting your vote on the Confluence. So we're moving from this asynchronous virtual voting to live voting to more efficiently arrive at consensus with committed and engaged members. We're going to accomplish this within our public calls with notification at the prior meeting. So there'll be a blast. The next meeting is a live vote, so please attend. And if you have stakeholders in your organizations that need to be rallied, you can do so and make sure that they attend the call. A very important facet of this is that we are going to ask for comments to be submitted as part of the end-to-end review. So there are some individuals in our group who save comments for the voting period. Given that we do have this very public end-to-end period where we integrate comments into that final data set, in order to arrive at something that's worthy and solid for that final vote, we are asking, even pleading, for any comments on the set to be delivered as part of the end-to-end review so they can be incorporated into that final set for public vote. So our first test of this will be a formal vote on the housing elements, complete closing out the housing instability and homelessness data set, and closing out the inadequate housing set at our next public call on the 29th. That means if you have any comments on the inadequate housing set, they need to be sent to us in time for us to integrate them into that set. So please do so swiftly. That means if you have stakeholders who have not seen it yet, please get that in front of them. If you have people you feel like need to attend that meeting, please invite them. But hopefully this will allow us to close set and move on, understanding that we are an integrative project. So whatever set we arrive at is something we've collectively developed. We will then test and refine over time. So I'm hoping that seems like a reasonable approach going forward. Any thoughts about that? Any concerns or questions? All right, it sounds like that is reasonable. I do have to say, I did a really, really thorough both public and literature search of cooperative voting processes to make sure the ethics of our organization and our collaborative were kept as we move forward. So just know we still, your vote, your voice and your comments. So Deb has a question. Does this broaden who's counted for votes who interested parties as well? So Deb, what we're going to do is do a formal call and see who's attending the meeting. And then if there's a question about committed versus non-committed members on the call, we will address that. But it doesn't formally change the fact that committed members are the voting members. What we did not want to do was do a member purge in order to achieve an easier consensus. We really want to make sure that if you signed up as a committed member that we recognize you and include you in communications. Deb, does that answer your question? So we're going to use attendance basically to ensure that we have representation of committed members on the call.
That helps. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome, Deb. Nice to have you here. Any other questions? All right. And again, I hope this also feels like it's supporting the engagement of the individuals that come to the call every single time too. So we're grateful for your engagement. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just review of inadequate housing. So these are our current housing data submitters. I do want to give a shout out to 211 San Diego and Karis Grounds, who helped augment the data set as it stands to make sure it's aligned with 211 methodology. We've talked about that being critical in the past, so we're very grateful for their collaboration. Next slide, please. This is the data element submission summary. Next slide. And again, so these right now until next meeting, we are still in end-to-end review. So as I stated, you can please mute your phone. Thank you. Thank you. So as I stated, end-to-end review is all the more important if we're going to be attempting to have a live vote at our next meeting. So we collate and develop this, the master sets together over the course of our calls. Review is a time to assess them. Are there elements missing? Are there incorrect concepts that need to be changed? And are there concepts that are unnecessary and should be removed? Next slide, please. So we are hoping this is a swift turnaround, but this has been over the last few calls. We hope that on the 19th, on Monday, you can download the latest inadequate housing master list, email all comments regarding data elements to the Gravity Project email, comment on whether items are needing to be removed, edited, or added. And we hope that we can get your comments specifically on screening and diagnoses by October 23rd. Again, if you have comments on the other data elements, it's okay to postpone that a bit if need be. If yes to anything on slide 26, does that postpone the vote so we talk? Lucy, can you help me understand? Oh, slide 25. Can you go back? Lucy, what are you saying? So if yes to anything on slide 25, does that, yeah.
You were saying, is anything missing? Have we gotten anything wrong? And so forth. I was wondering, so you're still asking people if they would like to make substantive suggestions. So if any of those questions are answered, yes, something is missing, something isn't right, do we talk about that, or we're still going to vote next meeting?
So part of the vote, as you can expect in our past calls, will be conversation about reconciliation, given the chat and given concerns. You've seen us do that in the past with the evolution of diagnoses, specifically in the inadequate housing set. You can even see that today. So we're hoping that, again, by participating on an ongoing basis and reviewing the set as it's developed, we'll be able to incorporate suggestions without drastically altering the set. And this, again, this is a hypothesis and it's a test. We'll have to see. But consensus is still important. Your feedback is still necessary, and consensus is still necessary. So we're hoping to have a conversation about any edits that have happened between the 19th and the vote on that next meeting. And then formally vote on what is there on that day as well. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, of course. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so this is, I'm including some things we've seen in the past here. So again, this is the current screening summary. We've all seen this before. Next slide, please. I have an update, and this is again what Lucy and I were just talking about. I have an update regarding inadequate housing diagnosis that needs some conversation. And so I look forward to having a little bit of conversation over the next few minutes. So for some time, really it's like static for about a month, this is what we've had when it comes to inadequate housing diagnoses. And if you all remember on the last chat, on the last call, there was like a literal plethora of concepts that we felt were missing. It was a really lovely conversation, and we spent some time sitting in the complexity of what was not represented with the code as we had it so far. So I did some work, and I talked with a bunch of inadequate housing experts, as I do, and I have a proposal based on the chat and based on those conversations to see if we have come to something that seems representative of the community's desires. Next slide, please. So indoor plumbing is a good one, and you'll see that will fit into the structure that I hope you that we're presenting on right now. So Again, everything on the left was what we had. So one of the things that we try to avoid when we're building terminology is an unending need for individual concepts, right? So we try to sort things into types so that you can have a concept or a code representing a type of concern. Because, for instance, on the left, we had lead. We did not have asbestos. We did not have radon. We did not have carbon monoxide. We did not have lots of things, right? And so we either would have to create concepts for each of those individual items, or we create a type of concept that includes all of them. So over the last 2 weeks, Carrie, yay! So over the last 2 weeks, and then another thing that we consider as we do our build are also trying to represent risk, right? Especially when we think about claims codes. Are there strata of risk that we can represent in our codes that can be used for risk analysis and prospective payments and aggregation for both in fee-for-service and in value-based concerns and in just internal process improvement? So the proposal is based on the literature of inadequate housing and housing quality to sort the concepts that we're desiring into inadequate housing and a new child of inadequate housing, which would be the concept of unhealthy housing. This is when housing is actually toxic to the dweller. So in inadequate housing, you would have substandard housing due to structural insufficiencies, due to poor temperature control, due to an inability to store prepared food, due to lack of safety equipment. This would include smoke and CO detectors, due to lack of potable water, due to overcrowding. And then as a placeholder, we are proposing that there really was an option to have a concept, substandard housing does not meet inhabitants' functional needs. So this concept, that ability to combine interventions when an individual needed, for instance, the lights we were talking about for the individual who's hard of hearing, or perhaps a ramp when an individual had ambulation concerns that were acute. So we're hoping this concept meets the continued desire of the community to have this concept represented in the inadequate housing domain. Then unhealthy housing would be, so Carrie's saying the functional needs is a good way to capture all the scenarios we talked about earlier. Yeah, we're hoping that's the case, and you can see this work carried over into transportation as we go forward with that work as well. Unhealthy housing would then be due to environmental hazards, and you would have mold, lead, asbestos as children of that. And then due to infestations, and infestations would then cover infestations from a regional perspective, again, the Hawaii, the Hawaii element. And then another element of risk that we're proposing is something, again, from a direct action element, substandard housing at risk of code violation. So this would cover those instances of extreme hoarding that we were talking about before, but would cover the housing specific concern within that element. So you'd be able to diagnose housing and hoarding as a mental behavioral concern, but also diagnose substandard housing at risk of code violation in order to leverage the housing resources required to address the actual need. What are folks' thoughts? Does this seem like a good solution to the problems and conversations we've had over the last month and a half? Yeah, so this is, so the question under environmental hazards, substandard housing due to toxics in the soil, that is something to consider, yes. What type of risk? We will consider toxins in the soil. So Ruth is asking a question, what types of risk are you considering? Wouldn't risk be based on the outcome of interest? Wouldn't each subcode be treated with the same weight? So actually, Ruth, I imagine that there is a capacity to diagnose levels of risk at the point of assessment. Subcodes would be treated with the same weight. Yeah, so the macro parent might have a different risk. Like inadequate housing would have a different risk than unhealthy housing from an acuity standpoint, from a clinical intervention standpoint, or it could. Again, this is hypothetical. But the children would be of like kind. So Mary Ellen is asking she's commenting on the addition of the code violation. All of the different concepts we're talking about are relative to whatever local, national, or regional codes you're applying. They are different. So we would have to take up the perspective from the point of assessment and then assess whether this code was reasonable. Subcategories. Yes. So there are possibilities for additional subcategories. So one of the things we are trying to do is do a first swath to get necessary concepts into the stream and be a little judicious as we test these concepts and then go forward. Again, more than 2 per room is that is the official diagnosis. That's the official definition of overcrowding according to HUD. But there's a lot going on here. So Mary Ellen Rose is asking, would they actually have an actual documented violation? I think that is a process element we'll have to work out in testing. I am not hypothesizing. I don't want to state the requirements for the use of the code. We just want to create opportunities to implement it. So with implementation and testing and piloting, we can figure out some of the process elements if that's okay. Matt, like substandard housing due to environmental hazard, I see how functional needs captures many of the things mentioned. But so much could be captured in it, it would be difficult to align any concerns, goals, and interventions associated with it. So Matt, I think this is a common problem with diagnoses. So as a clinician myself, the meta level of the code that I can apply is not often as granular as the concern of the patient. We are just trying to create like a bucket of which to create a direction. And if there's levels of granularity that are required in addition, like if we need to drill down further in SNOMED to specifically comment on need for a ramp due to accessibility issues, that is something we can propose. If you wouldn't mind, if you feel like those concepts are necessary, if you can send an email, that would be great. So Art is asking, isn't lack of potable water unhealthy? What makes some of these fall into one category or the other? So Art, the answer to that is the elements in the unhealthy category are thought to be toxins, like unhealthy to the person, whereas you can walk to a neighborhood spring and get fresh water and have ample fresh water for yourself. You just have to get yourself there. For instance, many individuals haul their water, and it's not an actual toxicity to the body. It's not ideal, and it needs to be addressed. And it's an inadequacy from a plumbing perspective, but it's not unhealthy in the toxic to the person perspective. I hope that's helpful. Whew, it's a lot of questions. So inadequate sanitary waste is unhealthy. That is interesting. So according to the we didn't see that in our literature review. So are you saying lack of, I'm trying to figure out what that would mean. For instance, I don't know if I understand what that means. Sewage issues. Oh, okay. Well, again, individuals can have, external composting toilets, right? And have, without having an unhealthy living environment. So I don't know if inadequate, first of all, it'd be hard to, I guess the inadequacy, here I'm talking out loud here. I'm gonna have to think about that one. Eric, if you wanna email me your thoughts on that one so that we can talk about it prior to next week, that'd be helpful. Okay. Because I think it depends on, I think I can imagine a statement that would be in unhealthy housing, and I can imagine a statement that would be in inadequate housing. I think it can go both directions, and we just want to make sure we build it correctly. Next slide. Sorry. Any other questions? What about contaminated well with no potable water source? Contamination is, as a regional problem, is covered in other elements of ICD, but this is contaminated water source. I don't think would be an unhealthy housing per se. Just trying to think about that. Have definitions again, Art. If you have thoughts about that, if you can email them to me so we can hash it out, or just unmute yourself so we can talk. Have definitions of unhealthy and risk, conceptual and operational, been considered? I'm afraid we might have different perceptions on this. So Ruth, okay, that might be something that you and I need to, first of all, I think we've had conversations on this regarding the TAC, but maybe, so first of all, Art, do you want to further clarify what you're saying in your comment, just so we can understand? What about contaminated well with no potable water source?
Yeah, it's just that, there are some places where, due to proximity to some environmental event, people no longer have potable water in their house. And in those communities, sometimes, people have to move, or sometimes they figure out how to truck in water and give them some way to store it for a while. But it seems like
Flint, Michigan,
those are some,
yeah.
So that's just the point is, I don't know whether that fits in this category or not, but I was wondering how we decide between the two, because that's like a toxic event, but it resulted in no potable water.
Yeah, and there is a water insecurity concept already that's coming in lack of safe drinking water, right? So Z59.4 currently represents those concepts from a person intaking it. So this is why I feel like that the concept of like lack of safe drinking water is probably contained in our proposal to ICD that asks to break apart Z59.4 into lack of safe drinking water and food insecurity and its children. So maybe if you want to talk to me about that, we can, because that's actually like water is sustenance to the human, because what this inadequate housing concept is supposed to cover is from a HUD perspective, which is about plumbing coming into the house. So maybe that's actually not clear from a semantic perspective, and we can clarify that.
And then it also might be for washing dishes and cleaning.
Exactly.
As well. Yeah.
So currently Z59.4 covers, for instance, the lack of safe drinking water element in like the Flint, Michigan use case, and then you would combine that, if needed, with a lead toxicity code in order to have the specific element there. That's interesting to think about whether that's where that gets sorted. So Mary Ellen Rose is echoing what you're saying, but you can't use unsafe water for cleaning. So I guess there's a question about whether potable water goes in inadequate housing or unhealthy housing. Does that seem like a good estimation or summary of some of the concerns that are on here? There are two different issues, diet and life. But does it make sense that we're wondering how to parse out available plumbing versus safe water across inadequate housing and unhealthy housing? Does that seem like a fair summary of what we're talking about today? And then in considering the Z9.4. Okay. So we will have to rectify. So Lita's asking if these are actual codes or proposed. These are proposed. Oh, inadequate housing is a current code. Yeah, and then unhealthy housing would be a proposal for a child. And then,
Sarah,
yeah.
I'm having a thought. I think this is really a fantastic exercise. Aside from differing understandings about what all of these may mean in terms of definitions, it's really work to figure out what's the difference between inadequate and unhealthy. And I'm trying to imagine intervention and realizing that at the local level, governmental entities responsible for any of these substandard items are going to differ. But I'm wondering ultimately who is responsible for fixing these things if the patient and the provider agrees that there's lack of safety equipment. Whose responsibility is it to fix that? If the patient and provider agree that there's asbestos risk in this house, whose responsibility is that? So I'm just leaping way ahead to how would this be fixed? And would that reflect back in terms of categorizing things or not?
So I think that's actually a really good statement. So we are responsible, and part of the reason why we came to this was working with our colleagues at 211 who do the connection to the individuals who are actually doing the fixing. So it was with an eye for intervention that this coding structure was created, right? So
maybe we're at the point, at some point we have to come to closure on this. And if we all keep in mind that something has to be done for any of these substandard items, this is the point, from my point of view, where piloting really starts. Are these categorizations helpful for, I have to say, well-organized and totally committed providers as a guideline for who to call locally?
what's interesting, because Mike is actually commenting in the chat box about something that seems very similar to you. He's saying, as someone who helps provide resources to people based on these codes, I think the most important question is, what will you do to help the patient based on the diagnosis? So inadequate housing means you connect the patient to resources to help get their housing up to snuff. Whereas unhealthy housing means you might send them to resources to help with new or different, right? Or abatement is different than repair, right? So each of the issues under environmental hazards requires professional abatement to really make sure you're addressing it well, which is a different intervention than simply getting someone a stove or getting them a proper heating facility or patching drywall, et cetera. So it was with those connections to resources and interventions that the structure was designed. So I hope that that's helpful. And Mike, that's very helpful. And Lucy, it's helpful to think about the need to pilot.
Sarah, this is Carrie. I have a question. So some of these, we've been talking about whether or not they go into inadequate housing or unhealthy housing. And I provided one example in the chat box, but how would a provider know necessarily? So for example, I have a rental and I have had tenants in the past who was and she was upset about pests. And so was I. And if she had been asked, she would have told the provider something different than if that provider had come to me and asked what the issue was about the company. And that would inform who they call and how they help that patient.
So you're breaking up a little bit, so I'm trying to make sure that I understand. So can you repeat the question so I can make sure I understand it correctly?
Yeah, so some of these seem to overlap, and how would a provider necessarily know that these are the correct codes in a given situation so that they could address the patient's needs?
So this is one of the hazards of, so by moving from specifics to, can folks mute their phones, Bean? Thank you. That was lovely though.
It was lovely, but turn it off.
So this is one of the hazards of moving into types, right? Is so it's not 100% explicit, but then that's where our definitions come in. And I do have to say, so part of what we're working on is with Bob's work in the technical side is each of these outcomes really correlates to a question, which can be asked that's in our screening and questions and answers set. So there's the possibility to rely upon the data that's available through the screening and questioning process to link to this, to suggest this as a concern. And then I think also from a provider perspective, I have to admit that sometimes I think it might be a matter of referring to a community partner who could then drill down on these concerns more granularly. So the double answer is the definition will guide the employment, right? And then hopefully, again, this is a concept we'll bear out in testing. Is that a non-answer or is that a sufficient answer?
That's a pretty good answer. I guess I'm not a clinician, so my experience in seeing screenings or shadowing in screenings is limited, but I definitely see how patients answer a question thinking that they are answering it one way to get assistance, whereas if it's a diagnosis and you're trying to treat it, essentially, the real treatment might be something different than what the patient thinks is needed, especially in housing and things like that.
Yeah, and I think this is where we always try to fall back on the social risk, social need perspective and identify the things that are actually directly important to the patient. I mean, this might be something that is identified in screening, but actually not the most primary concern for the patient from an assessment and planning and goal setting perspective. So one of the things I actually feel really hopeful about this is Lisa said this is a good start, and when approved in use, we'll begin to see how they're used and get feedback. We are continually making hypotheses here. We want to develop an approach that allows us to test intelligently and doesn't box us in. So, yeah.
What?
Oh, someone commented. No, it sounds like not. The most important thing, I think the move from what's on the left, if I want to just generally say, does it seem reasonable to move what's on the left to what's on the right as a structure to go forward to with our build to test and in the testing and piloting? Okay, great. Okay, so if that seems like an improvement, that's a great win. And again, we're trying to resolve these concerns before we go into the voting next time. Fantastic. And then Hasna said something witty apparently. So Carrie, okay. Oh, wonderful. So Hasna is saying in New York City, when pests are indicated, a responsible public or private community partner would investigate and the hoarding would be forwarded to NYC Housing Court. It would then be reported back to the clinical provider as the actual reason for the asthma skin disorder and need for the behavioral health intervention. Thank you, Hasna. Again. So Carrie asked a question that would mean that every state would need some kind of organization that investigates these things, though, and regions do need these. A lot of times these things happen through the 211 family or through community action agencies. One of the things we're hoping maybe is the data we create in the Gravity Project can create standardization of approaches. Yes, and say, well, they all have housing agencies, don't they? Yes. Right. So whether they all have sufficient programs to address the needs within the housing environment is another thing. And then Lucy says, yes, it does. It's called federalism. Oh, funny. All right. So I think we have some questions regarding water and water use and understanding that there is that code out there, Z59.4. And I'm not going to go to my next. We are running a little behind, so I'm going to stay on the call. I checked with my colleague presenting on the call over at AHEMA to make sure that that was okay, because I have to stay here. So we have some questions regarding water, specifically understanding that there's a code that's not on here, which is lack of safe drinking water, and wondering about the intersection of intake of water versus use of water versus plumbing to get water to the house, and whether there's a missing concept on here. Does that seem like a safe concern? And then other than that, someone's asking substandard housing due to environmental hazard. Maybe, I guess I think maybe you're just questioning. So Janice, do you want to, is there something you specifically want to ask regarding that concept?
Unmute. Hi. Yes, thank you for having me on here today. I mean, I don't come very often because I'm busy, but I was just thinking overall environmental hazard for, like, I live in Seattle, Washington, and we Duwamish is a waterway that was, you know, a very serious polluted site. You know, one of the, what do you call, I forget the names of it, but you know, it's same thing like with where Hanford is. The whole area there is considered polluted. It's a, you know, by the EPA, it's recognized as a site that needs to be cleaned up, the area, because of what was there before. So you could have housing where a gas station was before and you're not really aware of it, but it's environmental. So some of this falls into the environmental, obviously. I don't know. Let me think. I just think it's something that, you know, well, mold could be, but environmental hazard is a little bit different. Like, it's often, like I said, gas stations, oil, gas, other, you know, type of substances that are either near, or it's near a Superfund site. That's what it's called. So like somewhere, yeah.
I wonder if we could clarify environmental hazard by including the word internal or something akin to that. So we're really specifically talking about the environment within the household, right? As opposed to external environments.
So that is, it's inside because they live on the property, right? So this has happened and does happen around the United States, that sites have to be moved because it had been there for an extended amount of time for what. So it could be internal environmental, but environmental hazard, I think they'd understand. Also, there could be a spill or something in the neighborhood and all of a sudden they don't have anywhere to go. Right.
Yeah, so we did cover, so I think that's something, again, we need to understand, because we do try to think of concentric rings as things that are internal to the household and things that are external, but I think soil is something we may want to consider in the unhealthy housing children that we propose here.
Another thing is that there's a lot of people with very serious allergy sensitivities, and the building they move into could have something that they're allergic to, and it's a big fight with the landlord regarding that if they have to move out. But you know, it could be substandard flooring that was put in and was never changed. This is internal. So I know a number of individuals who have had allergy, you know, situations and have had to move within like housing authorities, and it's been a challenge, but they do look at it.
Yeah, so that's where the general parent might be able to suffice. So you don't have to specify down into mold, lead, or asbestos, right? And one of the things we wanted to make sure that we were doing was actually, by changing from the framework on the left to the framework on the right, was really allowing for something that was expandable without just putting every single thing in there, anticipating that it would be difficult to do that. So certainly if an individual is having an environmental intolerance that is as yet indetermined, I mean, this happens to me all the time in clinical medicine, right? Like, I don't know what's sick about your house, but your house is sick for you. You would be able to use the non-specific parent code in order to get yourself to the same end. That something needs to happen. I need to help my patient. I'm going to do these referrals, etc. Okay.
That sounds
good. How are we
feeling?
Okay. Yes, external. Yes, versus internal flooring. So I think so. It does seem that adding a little. It's included in the concept unhealthy housing, I think. It's not included in the SNOMED equivalent, which is substandard housing due to environmental hazard. So what we'll try to do is rectify that in time for the call next time. Does that seem like a good idea? We're having a really great conversation again. You guys are a great team, and we haven't even gotten into to the next domains. All right. Okay. Such an amazing conversation. Thank you. So, any other final thoughts on this before we go forward to the next slide? We just spent a half an hour on one slide, which is amazing.
Sarah, I would just comment that the distinctions, internal, external, to me are really helpful, because all of this is going to come to be known through a patient talking to a provider, not through a community organizing about toxic waste in the vicinity. So we both know, or we all know, that both of those sources of information potentially produce actionable recommendations or things to be done. But I think remembering that this information comes from an individual and not from a neighborhood group is helping me to try to make that distinction between internal and external.
You know, I think actually, though, you know, you just reminded me of something, and Carrie's bringing up that as well. So if the person is the reporter, right, which in all of the cases of the code we're talking about, the person is, I guess that it's affecting my dwelling is understood by process, right? So you would have, if the community is the interviewer, the community is the diagnosis, or is the intervention, right? Because Carrie had brought up a point here that sometimes there's external oil tanks that have contaminated soil, but it's not an environmental issue. And then, and Matt's making a point that, which is, okay, Matt's making a separate point that actual interventions are going to differ for each of these based on whether the patient's renting or owning their home. That's true. So I will try to consider some of the, we'll propose some of these things for the next call to try to see what we can collectively agree on going forward. Does this sound like a plan? It's been a fantastic conversation. We have a lot more to do, and luckily we have an extended time. Can folks stay past into 5:30 today? Okay, we'll do the best. Okay, carry forward. Next slide, please. Thanks, team. This is just an assessment again from this is the inadequate housing end-to-end review section of our work. So these are programs that are identified to help intervene. It is imperative. Again, there's been very few submissions to the inadequate housing domain. If there are programs that you know are missing that we need to include, please include them now. And there's actually a repeat here, but as the experts who work in these realms, if there's programs that are not currently represented in our programs and their definitions, please let us know. I do want to state very clearly that this work of programs and their definitions was in alignment with 211 to make sure there's semantic consistency, again, across the clinic and community setting, given the utilization of the 211 LA taxonomy across many of the social service interventions and organizations. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that here because programs are pretty concrete. If things are missing, please let us know. And you can find all this on the Confluence. Next slide, please. This is an update. So this is an interesting wrinkle when you're trying to ensure you have consensus. So one of the things Gravity does is try to ensure that its work is integrated and aligned with initiatives that are happening across the country with similar ends, right? So Evelyn is an amazing integrator of this work. She sits in many different committees. So one of the things that's come to light is that there are many different organizations working independently on goals across multiple different projects, right? So we recognize at Gravity a need to synthesize our approach for goals to ensure that we're not creating unnecessary silos if our job is interoperability, right? So Janice is saying there are programs to assist individual functional needs like so Janice, if you have any ideas of programs, please just send an email to gravity@emi.net.
Okay.
And then we can add them in. And always include a definition if you're sending a program, so that we can just go straight to the master, your program and your definition. So in order to allow time for consensus, we're momentarily pausing goal finalization. So we will not be voting on goals at the next meeting, because we need to get agreement on the terminology we're using for goals, the perspective that we're using for goals, whether it's always the patient or whether it's the patient and the provider and the population. We need to agree on syntax, like how we state the goal. Like, is there a verb in front of it? Is there not a verb in front of it? Is it just a statement of fact? And there's a whole bunch of other things, because we do not want to create additional complexity as we try to solve interoperability. So press pause. We'll be back. The intent is to hold all the concepts and the aims that are represented so far in goals, and then bring them back to the community. We are incredibly slim in the goals section of our work. So if you have goals ideas and still want to submit them, please do. But does this make sense? Like, so again, to ensure interoperability, we want to make sure we're building goals akin to other projects that are also working on goals work. Does this make sense for everybody?
Sarah, I think this is incredibly virtuous. Those first two bullets apply to every attempt to standardize throughout history. And so I would just interject the idea that this Gravity project and the number of people participating on it implies a leadership role. Mm-hmm. So I hope we don't get hung up on the idea that we might be creating another silo. Undoubtedly, we will be creating another silo from somebody's point of view. But on the other hand, our process is so communal, it kind of legitimizes, from my point of view, a lot of what we're coming up with. So let's keep the leadership role in mind as we try to reconcile. Thank you.
Lucy, thank you. And I can state it's actually from that leadership position that we're encouraging this collective consensus. So Gravity is in so many conversations in national initiatives that we're asking for this work to be done, and initiating the conversation.
Great. Okay. I just had to laugh reading these bullets because they apply to everything that I've done my entire professional life.
No, I know. So, yeah. And I understand that we won't pause too long.
Okay.
But I do think it's important to try to get some consensus if we can. Especially when we consider the work that we have to do from the technical side. All right. There's a lot going on in the chat. Okay. There's lots of really great conversations about implementation. I can't wait to bring all these things back after we start piloting and have ongoing conversations. It's going to be incredibly fun to have communities actually piloting these things and feeding back and affecting our build. Next slide, please. I think we're doing questions across. So transportation insecurity. Next slide, please. Sisters, we're leaving inadequate housing. I'm just going to say briefly, folks, again, send me your comments regarding screening and diagnoses. We're going to try to rectify these things and tidy them up in time to have an open conversation and a vote at the next meeting. Mail information too. Can someone put the Gravity email address in the chat for everybody? That'd be great. So our amazing subject matter experts, Jen Sistogal from LIFT, Alexandra King from CTAA, Dr. Ipek Center from Texas A&M, and Michael from Fager Consulting. It's incredibly, we have really great conversations every Thursday evening. Next slide, please, after this call. So far we have 5 submissions. So if individuals want to submit transportation and data elements, please do so. Next slide. Just a reminder that these are our current screening approaches that are most notable, even though we have a few others. You can look at the master lists when they're posted on the Confluence. Next slide, please. I wanted to just show the work in progress. So we're heading again for December 4th, agreeing on the need for a transportation insecurity meta code. But we spend a lot of our time, and again, this is a totally simplification of the conversations we have. Ipek and Alex and the SMEs all commented on this slide, because we're trying again, thinking of the work we've done in the past, to sort by type, or to sort by risk, or sort by need or relevancy, into children that we can build into SNOMED code. So this is all a work in progress, but you can see accessing health and social needs, not meeting functional and cognitive needs. This is akin to that concept we have within housing. In insecurity related to time spent traveling, insecurity simply related to affordability. And then some comments regarding insecurity related to distance to destination, limits available transportation options. And again, it needs to be stated that when we think about this work, we're always thinking both from rural and urban perspectives and trying to make sure we represent codes that are applicable across different settings. Again, this is just an FYI. We have a Thursday night seminar, and we look forward to bringing you back some things to chew on next meeting. Next slide, please. Again, these are the brainstorming questions we ask ourselves. Next slide. Any questions regarding transportation insecurity? Again, the goal so far, we have some screening questions and answers. We're agreeing that we need at least one ICD-10 CM code. We're talking about diagnoses. If you have any data concepts for screening questions and answers, diagnoses, goals, or interventions, please submit them. People are still talking about adequate housing, which I love. So I'll have to, this will be my weekend reading the chat. It always is.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, I love it. It's great. This is wonderful. So it's hard to believe, but we're adding another domain to our work. It seems like a lot, but I want to state we are still a consensus project. Our collective agreement is still what moves things from one point to the next. And the people that we serve are the intersections of all these things. So in the name of de-siloing, it makes sense to talk about these things as multiplying upon the experience of the human anyway. Next slide, please. Incredibly honored to have three really wonderful fellows who are national experts in financial strain and poverty, clinicians, all of them, Dr. Adam Shigadance, Dr. Andrew Pinto, and Dr. Jeffrey Colvin, assisting with the financial strain work. Again, because of that December 4th deadline, focusing on screening questions and answers and diagnoses. Next slide, please. Carrie, I've been trying to get a hold of Andrew. Well, I talk to him every week, so you're good there. Just an orientation. So we always try to include, so how did you get financial experts? The literature and our colleagues at UCSF Siren. So these are clinicians that specialize in the research of poverty and financial strain and how it affects wellness and health. So the medical social care integration world is a lovely community to be part of. So really great people. So as usual with Kickoff, when able, we try to offer definitions of both the positive and the negative experience. So it's important here to lay a groundwork of what financial well-being is. So financial well-being is a state of being wherein a person can fully meet current and ongoing financial obligations, can feel secure in their financial future, and is able to make choices that allow them to enjoy life. Financial resource strain encompasses both the subjective sense of strain as the result of economic difficulties and the specific sources of strain, including employment insecurity, income insecurity, housing insecurity, and food insecurity. You can see it's like a meta parent, right, of how economic resources and the limits of therein affect the experience of the individual. You also can see that some of the other domains we've talked about in here would be children if they were not covered in other domains and other sections. Next slide, please.
Sarah,
Yeah.
do you want comments or you want to get through this whole orientation first?
Oh, comment away.
Could you go back to the previous slide,
Yeah.
please? Yeah, I've just been dealing with a CEO who is persuaded that all that matters for health is making the right decisions about what to eat and whether to exercise. And my point of view is that not everybody can make those decisions optimally from a health perspective. So I'm thinking that in talking about financial well-being, I wonder if we could focus this in the last line, able to make choices that allow them to do something about their health, make optimal choices to maintain or improve their health. Enjoy life, to me, is obviously everybody wants to, but we are all healthcare types. And I think that it would be helpful if we keep the thread of why we're thinking about this. The reason we're thinking about this is not because we want everyone to enjoy life. The reason is that we want everybody to have the wherewithal to improve or at least sustain their health, right?
Exactly. So part of what we do in a kick, I think, if for those of us who were on the food insecurity work a year and a bit ago, we start with the definitions that are out there, right? Recognizing that part of the complexity of what gravity has to do is define things for our purposes, right? So part of what we do in the transportation SME work group, in the inadequate housing work group, in the housing instability and homelessness work group, is make sure that the definitions we have are fit for our purposes at hand, right? And that's part of our charter as well. So I like the idea of the health element in here. So we had to throw up, we're an evidence-based thing. So these are the definitions that are out there. And I agree, and those are already the conversations we're having, and you can see that in some of the discussions going forward about how to define these concepts for our purposes. That's part of what we'll have to do over the next time. So 100% agree.
Great.
Per usual. And it actually reminds me of your statement reminds me of a recent report that just came out from Duke on white supremacy culture and food systems, which I think is an amazing report. But I think it's really important to consider, well, what gravity does is consider the language we're using and make sure that it's meaningful and fit for our purpose. So we'll collectively do that together. Next slide, please. So these are some of the screening approaches that are out there. Oh, a back one. If we can just, okay. So those of you may know the Cardia screen. It's a core screen from the IOM report. So how hard is it for you to pay for the basics like food, housing, medical care, and heat? There's the Prepare Screener, which is this amazing assessment of material hardship. So in the past year, have you or any of your family members you live with been unable to get any of the following when it was really needed? And there's a whole set of options underneath there. There's the AFP Everyone tool. How often does this describe you? I don't have enough money to pay my bills. There's a couple different tools in health leads, which are interesting. So one is focusing specifically on health, right? Financial strain as it affects the ability to access the health system. And then another is general regarding living costs. So in the last 12 months, so sometimes people find that their income does not quite cover their living costs. In the last 12 months, has this happened to you? And then there's just a general concept of do you have trouble making ends meet? Right. So these are some of the screeners that are out there that we've collated from our literature review and from our coding review that will start off our work. And these are these will part of the master list that we posted on the Confluence. Are there any tools that focus on the ability to manage money to enable living within their means? So yes, so I would say that is a different concept than financial strain per se. However, knowledge is a concept within financial strain. So we are already talking about financial literacy and financial strain and material hardship and how to sort those things with the subject matter experts. And hopefully we will get clarity there going forward. So Mary Ellen, Roberta asked, does transportation insecurity fit under financial strain? The meta big financial strain concept includes all of the ways that not having enough money bear out in your experience. So insofar, the affordability element of transportation insecurity certainly would. So thank you. So, so luckily, financial literacy is an area of expertise of some of the subject matter experts that we're working with. So we will make sure that is addressed. And then making ends meet. So again, so simply because these tools exist, it doesn't mean that they're the best tools, right? So so it is one of the tools out there, and you're actually going to, so let's go to the next page because you'll see actually a really comprehensive tool as well. Is debt a concept covered within financial strain? Yes, it would be. And actually we're talking specifically about medical debt as something that might need to be called out specifically. Mary Ellen's asking about financial literacy. I'm not saying it's specifically a different subject. I'm just, so it's an element of financial strain, perhaps. It wouldn't be the same as a direct screening question specifically for financial strain, though. And again, Mary Ellen, these are part of the conversations we have with our subject matter experts as we go forward. But financial literacy is its own concept in the literature. I hope so. So if it seems uncertain to you, it's because this is part of the bi-weekly seminar that we're having with subject matter experts when we think about how to go forward. I hope it's okay. So in the kickoff, there tend to be a lot of uncertainties, and things start to settle as we go forward. So the SMEs also wanted me to bring to the light the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's financial well-being scale, which is a really lovely, robust scale. So how well does the statement describe you or your situation? I could handle a major unexpected expense. I'm secure. I'm securing my financial future. Because of my money situation, I feel like I will never have the things I want in life. I can enjoy life because of the way I'm managing my money. I'm just getting by financially, or I'm concerned that the money I have or will save won't last, right? So you can see that these are all concepts of financial well-being as was described on that first slide. So next slide, please. And then
Sarah,
also, yes?
If you think we were all over the map on housing, just wait for financial protection.
Oh, no, I know.
Financial, whatever it's called, I've already forgotten the mother concept here.
Financial strain.
Yeah.
I know we have choices to make, lots of choices.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part of the financial well-being scale is how often does the statement apply to you? Giving a gift for a wedding, birthday, or other occasion would put a strain on my finances for the month. I have money left over at the end of the month. I'm behind with my finances. My finances control my life, right? So as always with any of the domain builds, we use these screening approaches to make sure we are representing whatever outcomes we have from screening in our diagnostic approach, right? And we match interventions for whatever outcomes we have from screening and diagnoses to ensure there's alignment. So Janice was asking, does your money run out before your bills are all paid? So I assume that that's a concept that you're wanting to make sure is included. I think it was possibly included in some of the meta slides. We'll make sure that it is. Again, if you have questions and answers that you use to address this domain in your communities, any standardized tool applies. Please submit it to Gravity so we can include any aspect. If you can mute your phone, just so we could, or mute your computers. Okay. Hasna saying, agree, Lucy, making ends meet varies even among adult siblings, nails on every 2 weeks versus simply always having 300. Yes. So Hasna, this is actually interesting. So this is why, so again, some of the questions that are included, they're not necessarily great. Like, so one of my statements on, for instance, even my favorite 2-item food insecurity screen, the hunger vital sign, is it usually fails to identify my New England patients who are food insecure because no one's worried and no one's running out, but they only have fruit like once a month. So one of the things we do try to consider when we're suggesting screening questions and answers is their applicability. So maybe we'll collectively say that making ends meet doesn't actually represent the choices that individuals are having to make to get by, and doesn't actually lead to that quality of life and well-being concept as represented on the definition slide. So money enough for retirement. That's a really good concept. Okay, so looking at so Mary Ellen saying, looking at the comments in the chat is why I'm wondering about the overlap between financial literacy and strain is so foggy. So for next time, I will ensure that we come back with definitions of financial strain versus financial literacy, and maybe our subject matter experts can help us parse that out a little bit. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, next slide, please. Excellent plan. All right, so just some conceptual steps as we consider observations. So these, as we consider diagnoses, so these are some of the concepts the subject matter experts and I are working out. What diagnoses are necessary? How do we address income thresholds? This was a comment in the chat. Understanding that income thresholds don't necessarily predict financial strain. For example, if you are trying to balance childcare and supporting your older mother who's living in your house, you can be solidly lower middle class and still have financial strain. Understanding how to represent debt and medical debt, you can see this is also a comment in the chat. Understanding how to represent how strain affects healthcare utilization specifically, because as Lucy was mentioning, for our specific use case in the healthcare system, that is a definite point of concern. Wondering if there's strata of risk, whether financial strain is a lesser version of material hardship, and this is kind of represented in the literature, and whether akin to our inadequate housing and unhealthy housing elements, we want to represent that difference. So worry and stress financially versus actually not having a thing because you don't have enough money for it. And then we also need to consider how to sort out specific concepts that are covered in other domains, like food insecurity or transportation insecurity or housing insecurity. It seems to me financial strain is a representation of what are the debts, expenses versus available cash flow. It's both of those things, though. So running out, it's really representing the complete, the sea of the choices that individuals are making as they try to manage finances when worry is an issue, right? Yes, so yes, that's what I mean. So Lucy has a suggestion for financial screening questions related to health. Great. Okay. So Lucy, maybe you can connect us. I would love that. And then, and what do we do with concepts that are contained in other areas of the taxonomies? For instance, financial strain affecting medication use is addressed in other areas of the ICD taxonomy. This is a horrible wording. I absolutely dislike this, but needs to be stated. patient's intentional underdosing of medication regimen due to financial hardship, for example, is a current code in the taxonomy. And with our food insecurity bill, we're proposing a similar code regarding dietary regimens. So these are some of the conversations we're having with SMEs as we go forward. Next slide, please. Whew. I think that's it, and it's 5:24. So healthcare utilization and financial strain is a big tangle. So some kinds of time access is relevant to whether a person can afford medical care. Absolutely, Carrie. Yes. So a difference in choices and how it affects cost is an incredible concern. And one of the things we wonder is whether it needs to be its own special focus within a domain, because specifically the way we planned for this domain was kind of the meta concept. But it seems like one of the things we're talking about with subject matter experts is we might need to have a focused finances and medical access and utilization intersection period to make sure we're representing all of those concepts well. That's one of the things that SMEs and I go back and forth about. So again, because the meta concept was what we initially planned for, but then you suddenly realize that there's children underneath it that haven't been on our project plan yet that might need to be pulled out and identified. So homework, catch up on needed materials and recordings on the Gravity Project Materials Confluence page. Again, review the master lists for housing instability and homelessness, just and prepare for that vote next time. Please do submit housing end-to-end review comments by October 23rd in order to prepare for the vote the next meeting. Submit new concepts for transportation insecurity via Excel or via email, and then submit new concept for transportation via Excel and email. Again, focusing on screening questions and answers and diagnoses for financial strain. Although all concepts are welcome, we will get to goals and interventions in time as well. Oh my word, friends, we did it. Any other questions before we go? What a robust conversation we had. Anything that needs to be said before we close our time?
You're amazing. Thank you.
We
to
are.
all your staff.
We are a great collective. Thank you, group. And if you have any thoughts that need to be said, you can send an email specifically. And as always, so grateful for the collective. It is such important work, and I really feel like we even though we've changed elements to do it better or to evolve, we definitely are evolving as a community continually, and we're very, very grateful for that. Next slide, please. Thank you, Hasna. Next slide. Join the Gravity Project as a committed member. And thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend, and we appreciate you. Again, send your comments for all things housing. We have a vote next time. All right. Bye, friends.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.